lecture on the Portuguese Revolution, which I'm sure you don't even remember what it was, on the Irish question, on the crisis in Eastern Europe, several of those, Poland in and out, and so on and so forth. And of course, at the end of those 15 years, I look back, and most of those lectures were interesting, but in the long run, sort of not very useful. And I face the same problem this week. 2 lectures on perestroika. They have to deal with the last 6 years. And it would be, I imagine, sufficient if I simply said to you, well, here's what happened, and kind of run down a chronology of events and leave it at that. But being a historian and having this experience of useless last lectures behind me, what I'd like to do is, of course, what I tried to do in the article that I wrote, which I hope you will read in the book on Perestroika at the Crossroads. And that is to take a historian's view of perestroika, which is really then not to look forward from perestroika, but to look backward. What does perestroika represent in the history of the Soviet Union, or indeed in the history of Russia, going back before 1917? And my answer to that lies largely in the first lecture I gave and in the article I wrote, in a kind of structural analysis, if you will, of the major problems that all Russian and Soviet leaders face because of the geographical and cultural characteristics of Russia-the Soviet Union. So this is a historian's view of perestroika, looking back and trying to find some common elements that link it to earlier reform programs in the Soviet Union and indeed to reform programs or eras in the history of Russia. And I break it up into 2 halves, one dealing with foreign policy today and Wednesday with domestic policy. It seems to me that the 2 persistent factors in Russian and Soviet history that define the problem of perestroika and Soviet foreign policy are, first of all, the problem of economic backwardness, and second of all, the problem of cultural marginality. Now, those should be fairly familiar terms to you, but I will lead you through them again in the context of what has happened in the last 6 years. At the same time, I want to point out something else I said at the beginning, and which has been a recurrent theme in this course, and that is that reforms do not spring from the blue. They do not drop from the sky. They have prerequisites or preconditions, and they have histories. And they are part of a long tradition in Russian and Soviet history, maybe a tradition that has been aborted from time to time, but nevertheless a tradition, and that is the reforming tradition. Let's look first at this question of economic backwardness. Beginning in 1980 or 1981, it became clear to the Soviet leadership that the productivity in the Soviet Union, the level of productivity, was slipping badly. Now, this was a very disturbing statistic because the belief, deeply embedded in the minds of the Soviet leadership, was that the Soviet system, that socialism, was economically more productive, if not altogether more efficient, nevertheless more productive than the capitalist West. Now the stark truth began to appear, and it wasn't just a one-year phenomenon, and that is that the productivity of the Soviet worker was decreasing. The second very ominous development in the Soviet economy was that the Soviet scientific and technological community was beginning to show signs of lagging behind the West in the development of particularly microcomputers, but a whole range of electronic equipment and inventions. Now, in a world where computers and electronics dominate weapons systems as well as other aspects of contemporary society, this was a very frightening development. The truth of the matter had been, of course, covered up for some years. That as early as the mid-60s, when the economic reformers under Khrushchev had agitated for changes in the system, it was already expected that there would be trouble. But of course, even in a system which relies upon planning, such as the Soviet system, there was hesitation in the bureaucracy to introduce changes which would make the system more efficient. So that economic backwardness, which the Soviet leadership had thought was banished forever from the questions that they would have to face, returned in the form of lower productivity and technological lag. At the same time, it was also clear by the early 80s that the Soviet Union had become increasingly isolated internationally. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 had probably completed a process which was already underway. It certainly underlined the process of détente, which had become part of the vocabulary of the international scene in the 1960s and early 70s. And it exacerbated relations with China, who regarded the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan as a security threat to its own interests. So that by 1982-83, it was clear that Western Europe, parts of the Middle East, China, the United States, Japan, in other words, the industrialized West, plus important elements of the Third World, regarded the Soviet Union with great hostility or with suspicion. That this isolation reinforced this feeling of cultural marginality, that the Soviet Union, despite its claims to be now a global power with global interests, found itself in a position where it was on the defensive and the object of suspicion by the whole world. In fact, this is what dramatized this. Except for Soviet missiles, all other intercontinental and intermediate range ballistic missiles in the world were aimed at the Soviet Union. The Americans, the Chinese, the British, French. So that's not very comforting. Moreover, it was clear that the war in Afghanistan was going very badly. That the army the army leadership either had badly miscalculated the resistance of the Afghans, or else the Soviet leadership was unwilling to commit the kind of massive intervention which the Americans had committed. That hadn't worked either in Vietnam. That is, there were never really more than 150,000 Soviet troops in Afghanistan. Well, at its height, the American intervention in Vietnam had been 500,000. And that couldn't do the job. So this frustration in the economic sector, frustration in foreign policy and isolation, brought home to the Soviet leadership that there was something deeply wrong about the Brezhnev era. And to cap it all, there was a succession of superannuated leaders who succeeded Brezhnev, first Andropov and then Chernenko, and neither of these individuals had time enough, or perhaps even energy, in order to bring about any changes. There was a glimmer of hope under Andropov, because, as you know, he had had some experience in Hungary. He was also head of the KGB, which was, after all, the most well-informed group of people in the Soviet Union, and had in its files and archives sufficient statistical information to illustrate what was in fact wrong with the Soviet economy. But Andropov was ill when he came into power, and though he surrounded himself with a new group of more forward-looking advisors and made some tentative attempts to lessen tension in international relations, he passed from the scene too quickly to make a change. Now, in each one of these cases, therefore, what was dramatized again was the fact that the Soviet leadership was aging, and that it could no longer simply replace one aging leader with another. But something had to be done, something dramatic, in order to reach down into the sort of middle range age levels of the Soviet government and the Communist Party, and bring someone to the fore who would have more energy and vision. And of course, the choice was made to bring into that position in 1985 Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, one of the curious aspects of perestroika and glasnost, not so, I should say familiar but curious, is that it replicated, it imitated so many of the reform periods of the past, going all the way back to Peter the Great. And I've mentioned some of those characteristics before, and I'll just run down them very quickly now. First of all, there was the realization that a systemic crisis faced the leadership. Now, systemic means that the whole system is involved in a crisis. Secondly, that crisis has very serious implications for the position of the country as a great power. Thirdly, that the leadership does not fully understand how it can go about to change the system, how it can proceed. Even the first steps are not clear. Fourthly, that as soon as the reforms begin, even at a modest level, they engender political opposition within the system, within the hierarchy, within the elite, which does not want to reform, which wants to stand pat. Fifth, that the reform initially confined to the elite and begun from above spreads to the rest of society. It has to. Because in order for the reforms to work, you have to bring in larger and larger number of specialists, larger numbers of competent people who will replace those who resist. And you have to try to smash the opposition by publicizing the reforms and bringing in larger numbers of the population at large. Right, this is a pattern, and the pattern was largely followed in perestroika and glasnost. Even the words were the same. The words glasnost perestroika, преобразование, законность. These words were used back in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 1840s, 50s, 60s. What do they mean? Well, perestroika simply means reconstruction. Or преобразование, reformation. Now, restructure, reformation. In other words, you're not going to destroy the whole system. You are going to try to alter it in some ways, but you're going to leave the foundations in place. That's the implication. The word glasnost has no exact English translation. Literally, it means publicity, but what it really means in this context is the spread of information. It means an information revolution. Now again, the importance of this is, you must understand, the extreme secrecy of Soviet society from the mid-20s or the late 20s down to the mid-80s. Secrecy in many ways. That is, libraries contained special funds, special reserves, which are not like the Rosengarten Reserve Room at all, but they are closed to the public. And if you look at the card catalogs, these books are not in those catalogs. They're in a special catalog, which only certain individuals can see. High party people, specialists, people who have certain degrees in doctor degrees. Now, there's a whole literature. I mean, I don't mean belles lettres, but I mean there's a literature of sociology, economics, politics, history, physics, biology, chemistry, everything that is not open to the public. You cannot, unless you are a high-ranking party member, a member of the elite, you cannot subscribe to foreign journals or newspapers. That up until the 70s, you couldn't buy a foreign newspaper that was not communist. You couldn't buy the New York Times in Moscow, except in certain hotels where you could buy it, where foreigners could buy it for hard currency. There were, at the same time, information bulletins that were drawn from the foreign press that were circulated only among the elite. And these had 3 different colors, designed for 3 different levels of political power or awareness. There was a jamming of Radio Free Europe, of BBC, of Voice of America. It wasn't always effective, but this information was kept out. From time to time, there were campaigns in the public press, the media, against contact with foreigners. Of course, this was allowed to a far greater degree, this contact, than it had been under Stalin. But this contact with foreigners could, under certain circumstances, get you into trouble. And certainly passing information could bring you into a lot of trouble. So secrecy to the point where, in fact, within concerns, within enterprises, within ministries, within departments, people simply didn't inform one another of what was going on. Now, you can't run an efficient economy that way. You cannot have innovation and development, research and development in science, if you have all of these bureaucratic obstacles. So that glasnost is the opening out of information. It's a dangerous process, like the storytelling does. If you can't control something, you can't control anything. Zakonnost, from the Russian word zakon, meaning law, and zakonnost means the rule of law. or legality. Now, there's been a lot of talk about revolutionary legality in the 20s, but we know that Stalin destroyed this. And the attempt to restore some kind of legality, that is, that the laws say what they, or mean what they say, and that the law is above politics, this simply was not reintroduced into Soviet society. But again, unless people can understand what the law is, and unless they can defend themselves against arbitrary power and bureaucratic interference by the law that's on the books, then there's no hope for initiative, innovation, because you can always be cut down, you can always be undermined. There's no possibility of the sharing of information, because if you exchange information that's regarded by someone, your boss, as secret, whereas it isn't really secret, and you can get fired. Well, you've got to protect people against this. And it's hard enough to do it in a system like ours. Right, so these elements were all elements that were discussed back in the 1840s and 50s and 60s as being the foundation for a reformed society, to end the stagnation of that period. And the same thing was debated in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. Now, how do you create a society which is open, free? How do you create a law-governed state? How do you create all of these things when, in fact, power remains a monopoly of the party? Right, so those are the larger problems of perestroika and glasnost. They are easier to solve in foreign policy than in domestic policy. How true that is about our contemporary life. How much easier it is to fight and win a war in the Persian Gulf than to change, for Americans, who have an open society, relatively speaking, than to change and reform the profound social and economic problems within the country. So what you find very often, and this is not simply unique to the Soviet Union, is that it is easier to act abroad and to gain a reputation abroad than it is to gain it and sustain it within one's own country. I mean, one of the most popular people, foreigners in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, late 70s, was Richard Nixon. And even after Nixon had been forced out of office, I remember conversations with Soviet friends, they couldn't understand why. I said, he subverted the Constitution, that's why. Yeah, I know, but he was in favor of détente. Well, all right, so you get the same thing in the Soviet Union today. That is, Russians ask, well, why do you like Brezhnev so much? I mean, he's wrecking. Why do you like Gorbachev so much? He's wrecking our country. And we say, well, you know, he freed Eastern Europe, he evacuated Afghanistan, he ended the Cold War. Isn't that enough? Nobody's wrecking our country. So, you know, we see these things differently depending on perspective. Well, let's see what Gorbachev did in foreign policy. Again, keeping in mind that his main objectives, from my analysis, is to overcome economic backwardness and to end cultural marginality or isolation. Well, of course, the major opening is, as usual, a statement or a declaration on doctrine or on ideology. And beginning as early as 86, but reaching really its first culminating point in 1987 at the 27th Party Congress, Gorbachev enunciated what came to be known as new political thinking, or the new course in Soviet foreign policy. Now, he was groping toward this for 2 years. And once again, I don't want you to leave with the impression that he had come into office with this vision of a new world. No, he made experiments and probes. He made mistakes. He would continue to make mistakes and experiments. But by 87, you begin to get the outlines of a new policy. It kept evolving and evolved very rapidly, probably more rapidly than he expected, under the pressure of events. But this is what I think it amounted to as he foresaw in 87. At the 27th Party Congress, he made this extraordinary speech, and I select only one sentence from it. It's, I think, a very powerful sentence. Mankind has lost its immortality. What he meant by this, as he went on to say, was that the globe is threatened by nuclear death, by ecological disaster, and by a revolt of the poverty-stricken population of the southern hemisphere, or the third world. In other words, what he's saying is that humanity, not classes, are what now is at stake in the international system. And he did not altogether dismantle the rhetoric of Marxism-Leninism at this point. Perhaps he never will in his own thinking. But he took a giant step toward that goal, or toward that aim. Because he is really now stating for the first time that the conflict between capitalism and socialism is not the primary driving force of international relations. The primary driving force of international relations is saving mankind, saving the globe. And this transcends the class struggle. Now, nobody had ever said that before as a Soviet leader. Goes far beyond what Khrushchev said. You remember, he said war is no longer inevitable, and that alone seemed to be a great revisionist statement. Gorbachev went on from that point to gradually abandon this whole litany of communist vocabulary in international relations. For example, the notion of the correlation of forces and the struggle with imperialism. That all gave way to a new phrase: security is indivisible. And, as he put it, disarmament for development will be the key to the future of Soviet foreign policy. In other words, the arms race has contributed to the economic backwardness of the Soviet Union. That it has diverted into defense vast resources. Now, I'm not just talking about money, but one has to see almost with one's eyes. I mean, statistics are one thing, but to see with one's eyes the difference. You visit the Soviet Union. And the first time this happened to me in the 50s, but it kept happening in the 70s and 80s. You go to a military parade, and in Red Square or wherever on the October anniversary or January 1st, whenever it is, and you see military equipment. And I'm just talking about superficial impression. It is impressive. I mean, it works, first of all. It works. And the tanks do run. And you know those rockets work. You know that if you see the equipment of the troops, you even see the way they're dressed. Look at the quality of a greatcoat of a Soviet officer. And then look at the quality of the clothing worn by civilians. Or I remember once passing the Suvorov Military Academy, and the young kids were let out, and they came out, and it just looked like a group of boys that I didn't see coming out of any other school in the Soviet Union. I mean, in terms of how well-fed, well-dressed, well-groomed, everything about them, future officers. I mean, this was elite. This is where the resources went. The best technicians, the best engineers went into the armed forces, were brought into the armed forces. The armed forces was the only organization in the Soviet Union that had the right to reject manufactured goods, that is, factory-produced goods, because they were faulty or because they were ineffective. To do that in the rest of the economy. And so the army was very well equipped. The defense industry was, if not the most efficient, certainly produced the most high-quality products in the Soviet Union. Now, you cannot, that imbalance was so great. I mean, compared to just the way cars operated on the street, or the way elevators operate in apartment houses, or the way plumbing works. I mean, nothing compared. Everything was of shoddy quality compared to the army. Now, you cannot, it's one thing to have a militarist state, but it's another thing to have a militarist state in which the civilian economy is shabby compared to the military. The object then of defense or disarmament for development is to pull the resources out of that sector and begin to funnel them into the civilian sector. Now that's hard to do, but that was the idea. Therefore, the whole structure of Soviet strategy has to change. Instead of being an offensive strategy, which was based upon the experience of the Second World War, a revolution takes place in Soviet strategic thinking, and now you talk about non-offensive defense or defensive defense, sort of an untranslatable term, but what it means is that the military strategy of the Soviet Union after 1987 will be defense. Not a rapid strike against NATO forces or against the Chinese, but defense. And now this military doctrine is linked then to these political doctrines that confrontation with the West is no longer the foundation of Soviet military or civilian or diplomatic activity. And that international crises, particularly regional crises, should not be analyzed in terms of a zero-sum game. If the Americans win, we lose. If we win, the Americans lose. That is dropped. The whole idea then of a correlation of forces of this great competition. That in fact, what the Soviet leadership increasingly argues is that this is a multipolar world, that the United States has declined economically, Europe and Japan have grown economically, that China has emerged as a nuclear power, and that the Soviet Union is no longer in a position with the United States to dominate world politics. Within a short period of time, Gorbachev takes his message to the UN and there calls for a new world order. A world order, and which he pronounced before Bush got hold of the term, a new world order in which international conflict will be resolved peacefully by negotiation. And for the first time since the founding of the United Nations, the Soviet Union extols that body, praises that body, and puts its faith in that body to carry out this new world order. It pays all its debts up to the UN. It argues for a revitalization of all UN agencies, even the military one, which of course it pushed very hard, and the Americans didn't accept during the Gulf War. Now behind this Well, one more. Attitudes toward the international communist movement. The proletarian solidarity becomes, as they like to say in political science, marginalized. That is, the whole notion that there is such a thing as proletarian internationalism is gradually shelved. That initially Gorbachev says, well, we will have no more common forums, common terms, international meetings of communist parties. That every party is independent. Now, that is followed by a demolition of the Brezhnev doctrine. The Brezhnev doctrine, you remember, is the pronouncement by Brezhnev in 1968 that when a socialist country is threatened either by internal subversion or external attack, all of the socialist countries have the right to intervene. The Brezhnev doctrine was the theoretical justification for the intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968. That is, that the Soviet Union made, of course, unilaterally, but with the appearance of the Warsaw Pact through solidarity, made the judgment that socialism in Czechoslovakia was threatened, and therefore that the Warsaw Pact powers had the right to intervene. Now, Gorbachev rejects the Brezhnev doctrine. In other words, the Soviet Union will no longer intervene in the domestic affairs of any socialist country, no matter what happens. Now, you can imagine an American president getting up and denying the Monroe Doctrine. Or maybe you can't. It takes some imagination. As a result, Gorbachev, and you know, funny how history has, in some cases, this almost literary, or we, I guess, invent this, but it has an almost literary sense of closure. Gorbachev goes to Belgrade. And there, Tito is now dead, but there he, of course, justifies Titoism. He justifies it. He says, in effect, everything that the Yugoslavs have said over the last 30 years has been right. And everything that the Soviet Union has said about Yugoslavia has been right. That, in fact, as Gorbachev put it, all parties are completely and irreversibly independent. Now, you can imagine what effect all of these pronouncements have on the world. The most startling effect, of course, and this is not necessarily in chronological order, but nevertheless, I say it, the most startling effect was, as you know, in Eastern Europe. You remember the effect that Khrushchev's de-Stalinization speech had in 1956 on Eastern Europe, in which he simply attacked Stalin. Imagine now, well, you know, you saw it with your own eyes not so long ago, 2 years, the effect that Gorbachev's liquidation of the Brezhnev Doctrine and his declaration on the independence of communist parties had upon Eastern Europe. What happened was, of course, that the communist parties of Eastern Europe no longer had a chance to survive because they did not have Soviet support. And we know, going back to 1945, 46, 47, what Stalin knew, and that is that without external Soviet support, communist parties in Eastern Europe couldn't survive on their own. They couldn't make a go of it. And now that truth is brought home because in 1989, beginning in Czechoslovakia and rapidly spreading to the rest of Eastern Europe, the communist regimes are overthrown from the inside without any external help. No CIA this time, no spies from NATO, no provocateurs. This is purely an internal revolution. And it is led by whom? It is led by the students. The students. almost everywhere, particularly, of course, in Czechoslovakia, but also in Romania. In Poland, it's a little different there. The workers join in. But the initial attack in Czechoslovakia and Romania, Hungary, is from the students. These are the children of the communist functionaries. Many of them children of old communists who had been in the movement for years. But many of them also children of communists who were shot in 49 and 50, or grandchildren, and who knew that tale. And of course, it was a media revolution, too. It was an information revolution. It was a revolution of grossness, because these students knew the role of television. And one of the first things the Czech students did, after they demonstrated, and the police, who were still rigid communist, under rigid communist control, fired at these unarmed students in Prague and in Bratislava and elsewhere, the students took video movies of the slaughter. And they reproduced these videos and they sent them by courier, that is, by their own hand. They carried them throughout Czechoslovakia. And they were shown in movie houses. They were shown in private homes. They were shown in trade union halls. And it was there. You are shooting down your youth. Well, you can't get away with that. You couldn't do it in this country in the Vietnam War. You couldn't do it in France in '68. When you start shooting down students and you see that and the truth is brought home, the moral fiber of the government just goes to pieces. Of course, then the workers join in, and the intelligentsia, and there's a kind of general rising. So suddenly you realize that the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, which had, in the first post-war election, 38% in a free election, there's nobody left. There's nobody left. 40 years of mismanagement, corruption, misrule, moral bankruptcy have destroyed these systems from the inside. Now, at one dramatic moment I guess I feel dramatic moments in this lecture, but at one moment in Bucharest, in Romania, there was a kind of seesaw battle because Ceausescu still had a guard of loyal bodyguards and secret police, and he was determined not to give in no matter what the cost, and there was a lot of bloodshed. And people in the West, particularly in Western Europe, but also in the United States, appealed to Gorbachev and said, intervene and save the revolution. Save the anti-communist revolution. And Gorbachev said, no, not because he wanted it to fail, but because he refused to intervene on principle. You don't intervene for the communists, and you don't intervene against them. These people have to determine their own destiny. It was a very important decision. Now, the East German regime was, of course, the last one to go. It was the most conservative, and you all know that it went, and when it went very fast. Here, it was not just the students, though they were again in the forefront, but it was also the churches, which had for a long time been a kind of refuge for dissidents in East Germany. And once East Germany went, it was inevitable that the wall would go too. So that within 6 months, the whole defensive glacis of the Soviet Union collapsed. What had been regarded as a necessity of the post-war period, a defense against the revival of German militarism or whatever else, or of American militarism. This simply disappeared. Now, that revolution is so profound that there's no precedent to it in Soviet or Russian history, unless, with the possible exception of Brest-Litovsk or of the post-war settlement in 1920. But even then, what you're talking about is, back then, military defeat. What you're talking about in 1989 is, in peacetime, giving up without any quid pro quo, nothing back, no negotiation, No security agreements, no reassurances, no guarantees, nothing for the West. You give up several hundred miles and all the advanced defensive and offensive bases that you had for 50 years. That's destroyed. The question is, again, why? And the answer is to overcome economic backwardness and cultural marginality. If you're willing to trade this because you know that ultimately this is the price you have to pay for economic assistance from Western Europe and the United States. If you go in again, if you intervene, if you try to put down these rebellions, this will destroy, probably once and for all, any possibility of partial disarmament, any disarmament agreement with the West. Will destroy the possibility of trade, will destroy the possibility of technology transfer, will destroy the possibility of foreign loans, that the Soviet economy will then be forced back on itself, and that will lead to its total collapse. Now this was only the most extraordinary of the foreign policy decisions. They were followed by a whole series, or preceding, the decision to evacuate Afghanistan was again a decision which had very few precedents in Soviet or Russian history, and that is to evacuate a territory which was under your control, evacuate a country on your borders which was under your control, when you were engaged in a civil war in that country. But once again, the decision was made to the fact that, as Gorbachev said, Afghanistan, he said in 1987, is a bleeding wound. We are hurt. Was not accompanied with violence or all support for the pro-Soviet Afghan regime, because I think the fear that unlike Eastern Europe, what would come into power in Afghanistan would be an anti-Soviet regime which would agitate in the Central Asian republics for anti-Soviet movements. And that was not going to happen in Eastern Europe. But it might well have happened. It might well happen in a case. Finally, the China question. There were three obstacles to bringing about a relaxation of tension with China. And the Chinese defined them. They said this is what they are. One is the enormous Soviet military presence on the 4,500-mile common frontier of China and Russia. 4,500 miles. That is, the millions of Soviet troops, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, this was a direct threat. Secondly, as far as China was concerned, the occupation of Kampuchea, or as it used to be known, Cambodia, by North or by Vietnam. Now, Vietnam was a Soviet client and anti-Chinese, and Cambodia was a territory that they were attempting to control. The Chinese were supporting the dissidents or the rebels in Cambodia. And finally, Afghanistan. Now, look at the map. What the Chinese are saying is, we want to end Soviet encirclement of China. We've got this 4,500-mile frontier, you've got this military activity in Afghanistan, and you've got a pro-Soviet client state on our southern frontier that's trying to expand and bring all this territory under their control. Three centers of Soviet activity on the Chinese borders. You've got to get rid of them. And Gorbachev did. The evacuation of Afghanistan, the evacuation of Cambodia by Vietnam, and the reduction by 200,000 men, at least, and the removal of some missiles along the frontier. What did the Russians get back? Better relations with China. But Nothing concrete. So, in all of these three cases, in East Europe, the Central Asia, and Far East, you can see Gorbachev, it looks as though he's giving away the store. And this is the way it is regarded by some military leaders and political leaders in the Soviet Union. And he gets him, and probably has him in some trouble from that source. I mean, the army morale has considerably declined and deteriorated since 1985. He has removed many top officers, but there is a strong backlash, as you can see in the Supreme Soviet and in the high command